I used to believe that silence was safety, that if I kept my head down, worked hard, and stayed out of other people's messes, the truth would protect me on its own. I was wrong. On the day that was supposed to celebrate everything I had survived, everything I had earned, my name was spoken out loud for all the wrong reasons. In front of faculty, families, and classmates, I was labeled with a word heavy enough to erase years of discipline in a single breath: homewrecker. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I stood there while eyes turned cold and assumptions settled in. What no one knew was that I had been carrying a truth far uglier than the lie being thrown at me, a truth that involved power, money, and someone everyone trusted. That day wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment the wrong person spoke too soon. Because the truth I stayed quiet about was already documented, already witnessed, and waiting for the right moment to surface right there in front of everyone. Before that day, my life was built on routine and restraint. I woke up every morning at 5:30 a.m. in a narrow, one-bedroom apartment, 15 miles from campus, the kind with thin walls and a heater that rattled through the winter. I brewed the cheapest coffee I could tolerate, checked my calendar twice, and left the house before the sun came up. Every decision I made revolved around one priority: finishing college without mistakes. I didn't grow up expecting comfort. My childhood was defined by unpredictability. My father left when I was 12, not with an argument or an explanation, but with a note taped to the refrigerator and an empty driveway. My mother worked 2 jobs after that, cleaning offices at night and managing inventory at a small retail store during the day. I learned early that stability wasn't something you were given. It was something you guarded fiercely, because once it cracked, everything fell through. By high school, I was already thinking in numbers: GPA targets, scholarship thresholds, tuition balances down to the dollar. I didn't join clubs unless they came with academic credit. I didn't date. I didn't skip class. While other students talked about prom and parties, I was calculating how many advanced placement credits I needed to shave a year off college. College itself wasn't a dream come true. It was a contract I couldn't afford to break. I attended on a combination of merit scholarships, need-based aid, and loans that would take years to repay. Every semester, I carried the quiet fear that one misstep, a disciplinary note, a rumor, a complaint, could unravel everything. So I kept my head down. Professors described me as dependable. Advisors called me low maintenance. I took pride in that. Being invisible meant being safe. By my senior year, my GPA was a 3.89. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus library and tutored first-year students in statistics at night for extra cash. I tracked my expenses meticulously: rent, gas, groceries, loan interest, everything went into a spreadsheet. I had a conditional job offer waiting after graduation, contingent on faculty recommendations and a clean record. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Stability meant freedom. That was the version of my life before her. She entered it quietly, the way powerful people often do. Not with an announcement, but with proximity. She was married to a senior faculty member, one of the most respected names on campus. She wasn't officially employed by the university, but her influence was unmistakable. She chaired advisory committees, attended donor dinners, and spoke at events about mentorship and ethics. People deferred to her instinctively. The first time we spoke, it was outside a faculty office where I had been dropping off paperwork. She smiled, glanced at the folder in my hands, and commented on my organization. She knew my name already. That should have been my first warning. I told myself she had seen it on an email chain. Over the next few months, our interactions increased. She asked if I could help coordinate schedules for a fundraiser. Then she asked if I could proofread documents because I was detail-oriented. None of it was inappropriate. None of it was paid. And all of it came wrapped in praise that felt strangely targeted. I kept everything professional. I responded to emails promptly, kept copies of every message, and never met her alone behind closed doors. I spoke about deadlines, not feelings. About logistics, not people. I had spent too long protecting my future to risk it on anything ambiguous. Still, something shifted. Her compliments changed tone. She began comparing me to other women, students, assistants, colleagues, always in ways that made me uncomfortable. "You're not like them," she would say, smiling. "You understand discretion." I never responded to those comments. I redirected the conversation back to the task at hand. Then came the questions. They weren't direct, but they circled close enough to make my skin tighten. Did I find her husband impressive? Did I feel intimidated working near men with authority? Did I think ambition made people lonely? Each question landed softly as if casual curiosity, but I sensed the structure underneath them, like she was assembling a narrative and checking which pieces fit. I answered carefully. Neutrally. I praised professionalism. I avoided personal opinions. I thought restraint would keep me out of whatever story she was building. I was wrong. The first sign of trouble didn't come from her. It came from the silence that followed. Emails I used to get responses to within hours went unanswered for days. A faculty recommendation I had been promised suddenly needed more time. An advisor canceled a meeting without rescheduling. None of it was overt. None of it could be challenged. But it was enough to make me uneasy. Then a classmate approached me after a seminar, her voice low and hesitant. She asked if everything was okay. When I pressed her, she admitted my name had come up in a conversation about boundaries, about misunderstandings. She didn't accuse me of anything outright, but the implication hung in the air between us. I went home that night and replayed every interaction in my head, every email, every conversation. I searched for a moment. I could have misstepped. I found none. And yet something was already moving without me. I considered defending myself. I drafted explanations in my head, imagining who I could talk to, what I could say. But every scenario ended the same way. My words twisted, my motives questioned, my emotions framed as instability. In spaces ruled by power, silence often looks safer than truth until it isn't. So I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't care, because I cared too much. Because I knew the truth and I knew it wasn't simple. Because exposing it prematurely wouldn't protect me, it would destroy me. And because the proof I held wasn't something that could be whispered in hallways, it needed light and timing. As graduation approached, the tension around me grew heavier. People watched me more closely. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. I pressed my gown the night before the ceremony and reminded myself that once I crossed that stage, I would be free. I didn't yet understand that the stage was exactly where everything would come apart. Power has a sound when you're close enough to hear it. It's quiet, confident. It doesn't rush. It doesn't explain itself. It assumes the room will adjust. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. Her name carried that sound. When she entered a space, conversations softened without anyone being told to stop. Administrators straightened their posture. Faculty laughed a little too quickly at her comments. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention. She didn't need to. Influence followed her like gravity. I didn't belong in that orbit, and she knew it. At first, her interest in me had seemed harmless, almost flattering. A senior woman taking notice of a student who worked hard and stayed out of trouble. But as weeks passed, I realized her attention wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. She watched how I spoke, how I reacted, how I held myself when her husband's name came up in conversation. Her husband was everything the university celebrated. Tenured, published, charismatic in a way that made donors feel intelligent and students feel chosen. He spoke about mentorship and ethics with practiced warmth. I had attended his lectures once or twice, sitting near the back, taking notes like everyone else. To me, he was just another professor. To others, he was an institution. That imbalance mattered, because when power looks at someone without it, it doesn't see a person. It sees risk, or usefulness, or silence it can rely on. I began to feel that shift in the smallest ways. She stopped asking for help and started giving instructions. Not unkindly, just firmly. Deadlines shortened. Expectations increased. If I completed a task flawlessly, it was met with a nod. If I asked a clarifying question, she reminded me how busy everyone was. "You understand how things work," she would say. "I trust your discretion." That word came up often. Discretion. As if it were a shared value, a quiet agreement between us. But I hadn't agreed to anything. The comparisons became sharper. She would mention other women by name, graduate assistants, junior faculty, even donors' spouses, and comment on how emotional or unreliable they were. She always followed it by saying she appreciated that I wasn't like that I knew my place. I never responded. I learned early that disagreement wasn't required to be punished. Sometimes neutrality was enough. Still, I felt watched. I noticed how she positioned herself physically in rooms between me and others, subtly guiding conversations. I noticed how questions about my future were framed, where I planned to work, whether I would stay nearby, whether I valued loyalty. Each question felt like a test I didn't understand. The rumors gained shape after that. At first they were vague. Words like inappropriate and conflict of interest floated without context. No one accused me directly. They didn't need to. The uncertainty did the work for them. People filled in the blanks with whatever made the most sense to them. I stopped being invited to informal meetings. An advisor who once praised my work now spoke carefully, as if choosing every word could be used against her later. When I asked about a delayed recommendation letter, I was told it would be better to let things settle. Settle into what no one explained. That was when I understood the trap. If I defended myself, I would be seen as emotional. If I demanded clarity, I would be labeled difficult. If I accused someone with power, I would be reckless. The narrative had already been sketched, and I had been placed inside it without consent. Meanwhile, she remained untouched. Her reputation insulated her completely. People assumed her motives were protective, maternal even. If she hinted at concerns, they were treated as warnings, not manipulations. If she withdrew support, it was framed as disappointment, not punishment. I watched the doors close quietly. Opportunities I had earned dissolved without explanation. Conversations ended mid-sentence when I approached. The isolation was precise, surgical. No confrontation, no evidence, just distance. What made it worse was knowing why. I hadn't gone looking for the truth. It had found me accidentally months earlier, through a set of files I was asked to organize. Financial records tied to a departmental account. Emails forwarded without attachments removed. Dates that didn't align. Payments routed through the wrong channels. At first I thought it was a clerical error. Then I saw the pattern. There was an affair, but not the one people would later accuse me of. There was money involved, consulting fees, travel reimbursements, expenses disguised as professional development. Everything was just clean enough to pass a casual glance. Just messy enough to tell a different story if examined closely. And the center of it wasn't me. I understood immediately why silence was expected of me, why discretion was praised, why questions were discouraged. The truth wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Exposing it wouldn't embarrass one person. It would implicate systems, committees, and reputations carefully built over decades. I saved copies of everything. Not out of ambition, out of instinct. I knew better than to confront anyone. I knew better than to speak without protection. So I waited. That waiting cost me more than I expected. By the time graduation neared, the tension around me felt intentional, like pressure being applied steadily, waiting for me to crack. I was being isolated so that when the accusation came, there would be no one close enough to question it. I felt the imbalance in every interaction, in how easily her words traveled compared to my silence, in how her concern was treated as fact, while my restraint was interpreted as guilt. Still, I didn't fight back. I reminded myself why I was there. I had endured worse than whispers. I had survived instability, abandonment, and years of grinding effort without applause. I believed that if I stayed calm, stayed patient, stayed factual, the truth would eventually matter. What I didn't know was that she had chosen her moment carefully, and she had chosen it to be public. There is a particular kind of silence that isn't empty. It's crowded, heavy with what you know and cannot say. That was the silence I carried into the final weeks before graduation. I didn't choose it out of loyalty to her. I chose it because the truth wasn't mine alone to expose. The files I had saved carefully, redundantly with dates and timestamps, pointed to a relationship that had crossed professional boundaries long before my name ever entered the picture. Travel reimbursements approved without proper authorization. Consulting fees paid to shell entities that led back to the same private account. Email threads that referenced late meetings and off-campus coordination that didn't align with any official calendar. But there was one detail that stopped me from speaking immediately. A student. Not me. Another one. Younger. Dependent on funding. Quiet in the way people get quiet when they're afraid of losing everything. I had recognized the signs because I had worn them myself. And I understood with a sickening clarity that if I exposed the truth too early, without protection, without witnesses, without the right forum, she would be the one to pay the highest price. So I stayed quiet. That decision reshaped everything. Her behavior toward me changed once she realized I wasn't panicking. Once she sensed that I wasn't scrambling to clear my name or begging for reassurance. Calm in environments like that is threatening. It suggests preparation. She began to test me. The messages became oddly personal, cloaked as concern. She asked how I was handling the stress. She suggested that people might misunderstand my proximity to certain situations. She advised me gently to consider how rumors could damage young women with promising futures. I heard the warning beneath the kindness. She also began to isolate me further. When I arrived at events where she was present, she positioned herself strategically, always visible, always close enough for others to assume familiarity. If someone approached me, she joined the conversation. If someone asked me a direct question, she answered it for me. It was subtle enough to appear generous, effective enough to erase me. The pressure increased in ways that couldn't be documented. A professor hinted that I should focus on finishing strong rather than pursuing certain opportunities. An administrator suggested I might want to take a step back from departmental involvement to avoid distractions. Each comment sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a message I couldn't ignore: disappear quietly, and this will pass. I thought about the job offer waiting after graduation, about the loans I would soon be responsible for repaying, about my mother who believed I was finally safe after years of instability. I weighed the consequences of speaking against the certainty of silence, and I waited. The rumors sharpened as the ceremony approached. They were no longer vague suggestions of impropriety. They gained a shape that made sense to people who wanted a simple explanation. A young woman, an older, respected man, proximity, access. It was a story people recognized, and recognition made it believable. What hurt most wasn't the whispers, it was the way people stopped seeing me as someone complex. I became a symbol of ambition gone wrong, of boundaries crossed. No one asked me what had actually happened. They assumed someone like me wouldn't have evidence, wouldn't have leverage, wouldn't have the discipline to wait. They underestimated silence. I continued my routines. I finished my assignments. I attended my final exams. I responded to emails with the same professionalism I always had. On the surface, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. I slept lightly. I double-checked locks. I reviewed documents late into the night, organizing them into timelines, cross-referencing dates, confirming that nothing relied on my memory alone. I backed everything up. I printed copies and sealed them in envelopes I didn't open again. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. Not because I didn't trust people, because I understood systems. I knew how quickly truth could be buried if it surfaced without authority. I knew that emotion would be used to discredit me. I needed the truth to arrive without me pushing it. She sensed that too. A week before graduation, she asked to speak with me privately. The message was polite, warm. Just to clear the air, she wrote. I declined. I cited deadlines. She responded with understanding that felt rehearsed. After that, her tone hardened. She stopped pretending to be concerned. Instead, she leaned into certainty. She spoke openly about protecting families and preserving reputations at events I attended. Each statement felt like a line drawn in the sand. I realized then that she had decided on her version of events, and she wasn't waiting for mine. Graduation was the perfect stage, public, emotional, final. By the time anyone questioned what had happened, I would be gone. Another story people told themselves to make sense of discomfort. She counted on my silence to complete the narrative. What she didn't know was that silence can also be preparation. I had already taken one step I hadn't told anyone about. Quietly, carefully, I had requested a meeting, not with a faculty member, not with an administrator, but with someone whose role existed specifically for moments like this. Someone trained to look at documents without assumptions. Someone who understood timing. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I presented facts, dates, numbers, patterns. I asked a single question: what would be the appropriate way to address this if it became public? The answer was simple, and it terrified me. Public is where truth survives, I was told, but only if it arrives with proof. So I waited. I pressed my graduation gown the night before the ceremony. I laid out my shoes. I reviewed the seating chart. I told my mother I loved her and promised her everything was fine. I slept for 3 hours. The next morning I walked into that auditorium knowing two things with absolute certainty. She was going to accuse me. And when she did, the truth would finally have witnesses. By the time graduation week arrived, the story about me no longer needed a narrator. It moved on its own. I felt it in the way conversations stopped when I walked past, in the way people's expressions tightened before smoothing into politeness, in the sudden caution in voices that used to be warm. No one confronted me directly. That would have required certainty. Instead, they let implication do the work. It began with emails. Messages that used to include me now arrived without my name in the thread. Calendars updated without notifying me. A departmental announcement listed student contributors and somehow omitted mine despite months of documented work. When I asked about it, the response was apologetic but vague. We didn't want to complicate things right now. Complicate what no one said. I watched my reputation shrink without a single accusation ever being written down. It was as if someone had erased me softly, carefully, so no one would notice the act itself, only the absence afterward. The rumors changed shape depending on who repeated them. To some, I was reckless. To others, manipulative. To a few, naive and easily led. Each version required less evidence than the last. The more they spread, the less anyone felt the need to verify them. Familiarity replaced truth. I stopped correcting people, not because I didn't want to defend myself, but because I could see how defensive women were treated in those spaces. Explanation was interpreted as guilt. Emotion was labeled instability. Silence at least preserved my dignity. Still, the weight of it was relentless. I questioned myself constantly. Replayed conversations. Reread emails searching for tone I might have missed, for phrasing that could be twisted. I wondered if my refusal to participate in social rituals, coffee chats, small talk, flattery, had made me an easy target. In environments built on perception, neutrality is often mistaken for defiance. What hurt most was the loneliness. There is a specific isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who have decided who you are without asking. Friends I had studied with for years now kept their distance, not out of malice, but fear. Association felt risky. Silence felt safer. One afternoon, I overheard two administrators talking in the hallway. They didn't see me at first. My name came up, followed by a pause. Then one of them said quietly, "It's unfortunate. She had so much potential." Past tense. I went home that night and sat in the dark, the glow of my laptop, the only light in the room. I opened the folder I had carefully organized over months. Every document was labeled. Every email archived. Every timeline cross-checked. It was all there. Enough to dismantle the story being built around me. And still, I waited, because I understood something they didn't. Rumors thrive in ambiguity. Truth requires context. If I released everything too early without structure, it would be dismissed as a desperate defense. I needed the truth to arrive in a space where it couldn't be minimized. She continued to apply pressure. Her public persona sharpened in subtle ways. She spoke more frequently about boundaries at events, about protecting families, about the dangers of misplaced ambition. Each comment was general enough to be defensible, specific enough to sting. At one reception, she placed a hand on my arm in front of others and asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes if I was holding up okay under all the attention. The implication was clear. I was the source of discomfort. I was the problem being managed. I didn't pull away. I didn't react. I met her gaze and nodded. That moment, my refusal to flinch changed something. Her smile tightened. She withdrew her hand. From that point on, the strategy shifted from containment to destruction. The rumor gained its most damaging detail just days before graduation. The word itself, homewrecker, appeared for the first time, whispered in corners, then repeated with confidence. It was simple, loaded, final. It required no explanation. People knew exactly where to place it. I learned about it from a student I barely knew. She looked uncomfortable even saying it, as if the word burned her mouth. I thanked her for telling me. She apologized as though she had done something wrong. I went back to my apartment and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. That word was designed to end conversations, to reduce a woman to a single moral failure, to make nuance irrelevant. I thought about my mother, who would be sitting in the audience on graduation day, proud and unaware. I thought about the job offer waiting for me, about background checks and character assessments. I thought about how easily years of effort could be undone by a label. For the first time, I felt fear not of exposure but of erasure. That night, I received a message from an authority figure I hadn't expected to hear from again. The meeting I had quietly requested weeks earlier had resulted in something I didn't yet understand. The message was brief, neutral. It confirmed attendance at the graduation ceremony. It included a note: if anything occurs that requires clarification, remain calm. Remain calm. It wasn't reassurance. It was instruction. I understood then that the situation had moved beyond rumor. People with real power were paying attention. Not because they cared about me personally, but because the evidence I had provided raised questions they couldn't ignore. That realization steadied me. The day before graduation, I walked the campus one last time alone. I passed buildings where I had spent nights studying, lawns where I had eaten cheap lunches between shifts, hallways where I had felt invisible and safe. I realized how much I had already survived, how much I had endured quietly without recognition. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would not beg for belief. Graduation morning arrived clear and bright. I put on my gown, pinned my honor cords, and checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same as I always had, calm, composed, unremarkable. No one looking at me would guess what was about to unfold. As I joined the procession and took my seat among hundreds of graduates, I felt the air change. Conversations hummed around me. Families filled the auditorium. Faculty took their places on stage. And somewhere behind me, I knew she was watching. She had chosen this moment to finish the story she started. She didn't realize it was also the moment it would finally fall apart. Graduation ceremonies are designed to blur individual faces into a collective achievement. Rows of identical gowns, programs printed with hundreds of names. Applause that rises and falls in waves. It's meant to be impersonal, ceremonial, safe. That morning, it felt anything but. I sat in my assigned seat, hands folded in my lap, the stiff fabric of my gown scratching lightly at my wrists. The auditorium hummed with anticipation. Parents leaned forward with phones already raised. Faculty members adjusted their robes on stage. The dean stepped to the podium and began the familiar speech about perseverance, resilience, and integrity. I listened carefully, not because the words were new, but because I needed to stay grounded. I focused on my breathing. In, out, slow, calm. I reminded myself of the instructions I had been given. Remain calm. My mother sat somewhere in the middle rows. I could picture her clearly, hair neatly styled, hands clasped around the program, eyes searching the crowd for me. She had taken a day off work and driven 3 hours to be there. She believed this day marked the end of our uncertainty. I didn't want her last memory of my college years to be confusion. Names began to be called. One by one, students crossed the stage to applause. Some waved, some cried, some stumbled under the weight of their own excitement. I clapped when appropriate, smiled when eyes met mine, kept my posture straight. From the outside, I was indistinguishable from anyone else. Inside, I was counting seconds. When the dean paused between sections of the program, the shift in the room was almost imperceptible. A brief consultation near the podium. A glance toward the front rows, reserved for honored guests and faculty families. A microphone adjusted. That was when she stood. She didn't rush. She didn't look angry. She looked composed, concerned even. The kind of expression that signaled moral authority. When people noticed her movement, their attention followed instinctively. Whispers rippled outward as recognition spread. She was known, respected, trusted. She addressed the dean first quietly, but the microphone picked up her voice anyway. There was a hesitation, as if she were weighing whether to speak. The pause worked in her favor. It framed what came next as reluctant honesty, rather than intention. "I didn't plan to do this today," she said, her voice steady but strained. "But I can't sit here and pretend nothing is wrong." The room fell into a stunned silence. I felt it before she said my name, the tightening in my chest, the way the air seemed to thicken. Still, I didn't move. I didn't look at her. I stared straight ahead. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the rows of graduates before landing precisely where I sat. "There is a young woman here today," she continued, "whose actions have caused real harm to a family, to a marriage, and to people who trusted her." A murmur spread through the audience. I heard someone gasp. I heard my name spoken not by her but by someone nearby, whispered in recognition. Then she said it. "She is a homewrecker." The word hit the room like a dropped plate, sharp, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. For a moment time fractured. Sound dulled. My ears rang. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Hundreds of faces turned toward me in unison, curiosity hardening into judgment as they searched my expression for confirmation. I didn't give them one. I stayed seated. I kept my hands folded. I didn't shake my head or protest. I didn't stand up. Every instinct screamed at me to speak, to deny, to defend myself. But I remembered the warning. I remembered the preparation. I remembered that reacting would only complete the picture she was painting. On stage, the dean looked frozen. Faculty members exchanged glances. No one intervened immediately because no one expected a woman like her to lie publicly. The assumption was that she wouldn't risk her reputation without certainty. She continued, emboldened by the silence. "I believe the university has a responsibility to acknowledge misconduct," she said, "especially when it involves vulnerable people and abuse of trust." Her phrasing was careful. She never described what I had supposedly done. She didn't need to. The label did the work for her. People filled in the details themselves, drawing from the oldest, simplest narrative available. I heard my mother's voice somewhere behind me. She said my name softly at first, then louder. Confused. Alarmed. I didn't turn around. That decision cost me something I can't fully describe. There is a particular pain in knowing someone you love is being hurt by a lie spoken about you and choosing not to comfort them yet. It felt cruel. Necessary. I stayed still. Finally, the dean cleared his throat and raised a hand. His voice, when it came, was strained but formal. "This is highly inappropriate," he said. "This ceremony is not the place," she interrupted him just slightly, not with anger but insistence. "Then where is she?" asked. "If not here, in front of witnesses." That word witnesses landed differently for me. The dean hesitated. The pause stretched long enough for discomfort to settle deep into the room. This was no longer about protocol. It was about authority. And authority doesn't like to appear uncertain. That was when someone else stood. Not her husband. Not an administrator scrambling for control. Someone else. The movement came from the side aisle near the reserved seating. A figure rose slowly, deliberately, and approached the stage without urgency. The confidence in their posture cut through the chaos. They didn't ask permission. They didn't look at her. They looked at the dean. "I believe this ceremony has already become the appropriate place," they said into a microphone that hadn't been offered yet. "Because what's being alleged here can be addressed with facts." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The person turned, then not toward her, but toward me. "Remain seated," they said calmly. "And please don't respond." I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time that morning. She stiffened, just slightly. It was the first visible crack in her composure. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I'm simply trying to protect." "Protection," the voice interrupted, "does not require defamation." The room was completely silent now. Phones lowered. Programs forgotten. Every eye was fixed on the exchange unfolding in real time. I realized then that she had miscalculated. She had assumed the stage belonged to her, that her reputation would shield her, that I would either crumble or explode, confirming the story she had told. She hadn't accounted for preparation. She hadn't accounted for proof. And she hadn't accounted for the fact that the truth, when it finally arrives, prefers witnesses. I sat there, heart pounding, as the ceremony paused around me. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. But for the first time in months, I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer alone in the room. The silence that followed felt heavier than the accusation itself. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was anticipation. The person standing near the stage didn't raise their voice. They didn't introduce themselves with titles or credentials. They didn't need to. Authority, I was learning, announces itself through composure, not volume. The dean looked relieved and unsettled at the same time, as if grateful for the interruption but uncertain of the cost. He nodded slowly, stepping aside from the podium without fully relinquishing it. "This ceremony will pause briefly," the dean said into the microphone. "Please remain seated." Murmurs rippled through the audience, but no one stood, no one left. Curiosity anchored them in place. What had begun as a celebration had turned into something else entirely, a public reckoning unfolding without a script. The woman who had accused me tightened her grip on the edge of the stage. Up close, I could see the tension in her shoulders. She had expected shock, maybe sympathy. She had not expected resistance. "This is unnecessary," she said, forcing a small, strained laugh. "We're here to honor students, not air personal matters." The response was immediate and measured. "You made it a public matter when you used a public platform to make a personal accusation," the voice replied. "The student you named has remained silent. That restraint deserves respect." I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me again. This time they weren't searching for guilt. They were searching for permission to reconsider. The person stepped fully into view, then standing between the podium and the first row of faculty. They spoke clearly, each word chosen with care. "I was asked to attend today in an observational capacity," they said. "That request was made weeks ago." Her head snapped up. For the first time, real alarm flashed across her face. "We've received materials," the speaker continued, "that raised concerns about misuse of authority, financial irregularities, and deliberate misrepresentation of events. Those materials were reviewed prior to today." A collective breath was released across the auditorium. I sat perfectly still. My hands no longer shook. My heart still raced, but it was different now, focused, alert, controlled. This was the moment I had been waiting for, even if I hadn't known exactly how it would arrive. "This ceremony was not intended to be the forum for clarification," the speaker said, But since accusations have been made publicly, clarity must follow publicly as well. The woman stepped forward, her composure fraying at the edges. You're implying things without evidence, she said sharply. This is irresponsible. The response was calm. No, the speaker replied. What would be irresponsible is ignoring evidence because of who it implicates. They turned slightly toward the dean. With your permission, they said, I'd like to outline why the accusation made moments ago cannot stand. The dean hesitated only briefly before nodding. At that point, control was already an illusion. The speaker addressed the audience again. The term that was just used carries serious moral and professional consequences, they said. It suggests an affair, exploitation, and intent. Those implications require substantiation. They paused. There is none. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. The student in question, the speaker continued gesturing toward me without naming me, has no documented personal relationship with the individual implied. No messages. No meetings outside professional settings. No financial benefit. No corroborating witness. Her mouth opened, then closed again. However, the speaker added there is documentation of other relationships and transactions that warrant attention. The word transactions landed hard. I watched her carefully then. The way her eyes flicked toward the faculty section, toward her husband, toward the exits. She was calculating, searching for a way to regain narrative control. You can't seriously be doing this here, she said. This is harassment. The speaker didn't flinch. What occurred moments ago was defamation, they replied. This is correction. They turned to the dean again. We recommend that the student be allowed to complete this ceremony without further incident, they said. Any additional matters can and will be addressed through appropriate channels immediately following. The dean nodded again, visibly shaken. Before anyone could move on, the speaker added one final statement. For the record, they said, voice carrying effortlessly across the room, the individual who made the accusation has been advised prior to today to refrain from public statements regarding this matter. The implication was unmistakable. Gasps scattered through the audience. Whispers erupted and were quickly hushed. People leaned toward each other, connecting dots they hadn't known existed minutes earlier. The woman's face drained of color. You warned her, she said, barely audible. The speaker met her gaze. Yes, they said simply. There was nothing left to argue. The dean cleared his throat again, visibly eager to restore order. Thank you, he said stiffly. We will resume the ceremony. The speaker stepped back into the aisle, not toward the exit, but toward a seat among other officials who had remained conspicuously silent until now. The program resumed, but the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Names were called. Applause followed, uneven and distracted. No one was fully present anymore. Every clap carried the weight of what had just been revealed without being fully explained. When my name was called, the pause, before applause, felt eternal. I stood. As I walked toward the stage, my legs felt steady in a way they hadn't in months. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at her husband. I focused on the dean, who met my gaze with something close to apology. The applause grew louder as I crossed the stage. Not raucous, not celebratory, but deliberate, intentional. People weren't cheering a success story anymore. They were acknowledging endurance. When I took the diploma, the dean leaned in slightly. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I nodded. That was enough. As I stepped off the stage, I caught sight of my mother. Her face was pale, her eyes glossy, but when she saw me, she stood and clapped harder than anyone else in the room. I returned to my seat without expression, without triumph, because I knew this wasn't over. What had just happened wasn't exposure. It was permission. The truth had been acknowledged as something worth examining. And once that door opens, it never closes quietly. After the ceremony resumed, time moved strangely. The rest of the names blurred together, applause rising and falling without rhythm. What lingered in the air wasn't confusion anymore, it was expectation. Everyone sensed that the interruption hadn't been a conclusion. It was a hinge. When the final name was called, and the last cap tossed into the air, the dean announced a brief recess before the reception. Faculty were asked to remain. Graduates were asked politely but firmly to stay nearby. The doors at the back of the auditorium didn't open. I stayed in my seat until an usher approached and spoke quietly, asking me to follow them. My mother stood immediately alarmed, but I placed a hand on her arm and shook my head. I'll be right back, I said. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. We were led to a smaller hall adjacent to the auditorium. It smelled like polished wood and old paper. A long table had been set up with folders stacked neatly at one end. Several officials were already there, standing rather than sitting, as if no one wanted to claim authority prematurely. She arrived moments later, flanked by her husband. The difference between them was stark. He looked stunned, pale, as though the floor had shifted beneath him without warning. She looked controlled, rigid, her jaw set in defiance. The person who had intervened earlier entered last and closed the door behind them. "Let's proceed," they said calmly. No one argued. The first folder was opened, and with it the room changed. Pages were laid out methodically, printed emails, financial summaries, calendars annotated with dates and times. There was no commentary at first, just evidence placed where everyone could see it. The silence stretched as eyes moved across the documents. "These records," the speaker said, "show consulting payments approved outside standard review processes. The entities receiving them trace back to a private account shared by 2 individuals." She leaned forward slightly. "That doesn't prove anything." "It establishes a pattern," the speaker replied. "Now, let's look at timelines." Another set of documents was revealed: travel reimbursements, overlapping with academic breaks, expenses labeled as conferences that didn't exist, hotel receipts from cities where no events were scheduled. Each item alone could be dismissed. Together, they told a story too consistent to ignore. Her husband spoke for the first time, then his voice strained. "This has nothing to do with the student you accused." "That's correct," the speaker said. "It doesn't." The room seemed to exhale collectively. "And that," the speaker continued, "is precisely the point." They turned to the next folder. "This," they said, "is correspondence between the accuser and several administrators predating the ceremony. In these messages, concern is expressed about potential exposure of a relationship and associated financial irregularities. The language used indicates intent to redirect scrutiny." I watched her carefully as those words landed. Her eyes didn't leave the table. Her hands clenched and unclenched once, then stilled. "There is also," the speaker added, "communication, advising the accuser to refrain from public statements." That advice was ignored. One of the administrators cleared their throat. "We need to discuss jurisdiction." "We will," the speaker replied. "But first, accuracy." They turned to me then. "You were asked," they said, "to assist with document organization earlier this year." I nodded. "You retained copies?" "Yes." "Without altering them?" "Yes." "Because you believed they might matter?" "Yes." That was the extent of my testimony. No emotion, no narrative, just confirmation. The next folder was thinner. When it opened, I recognized it immediately. This was the piece I had guarded most carefully. "These records," the speaker said, "include testimony from a student not present today whose identity will remain confidential at this stage." Her head snapped up. "You can't." "We can," the speaker said, "and we will." They summarized without sensationalism. A relationship that began under mentorship, pressure disguised as opportunity, financial dependence leveraged into silence. The details were presented clinically stripped of drama. That made them harder to deny. Her husband sank into a chair. "I didn't know," he said quietly. The speaker didn't respond to him. Their focus remained on her. "The student you accused," they said, "did not participate in this relationship. She did not benefit from it. She did not conceal it for personal gain." They paused. She remained silent to avoid harming another student. That was the moment the room shifted again. Not because of outrage, but because of recognition. Silence reframed as restraint looks different. One of the administrators spoke, voice tight. "We need to initiate a formal review." "Yes," the speaker agreed. "Effective immediately." They turned to her. "Given the public nature of your accusation," they said, "and the evidence now on record, you will be asked to issue a written retraction and apology. Failure to do so will escalate this matter beyond the institution." She stood abruptly. "You're destroying my family." The speaker met her gaze evenly. "No," they said. "Your choices did that. Today simply made them visible." She looked around the room, searching for support. She found none. Even her husband wouldn't meet her eyes. I felt something loosen inside me, not relief exactly, but release. The burden I had carried quietly for months was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the truth now supported by witnesses and records and process. The meeting concluded without ceremony. Instructions were given, timelines established. The room emptied slowly, each person leaving with the weight of what they had just seen. When it was over, the speaker approached me privately. "You did the right thing," they said. "Waiting wasn't weakness." I nodded. Words felt unnecessary. Outside, the reception had begun. Laughter sounded distant, almost unreal. My mother found me near the exit, her face etched with concern. I took her hands and looked at her fully. "It's over," I said. "The truth's out." She pulled me into an embrace that felt like shelter. Not everything had been resolved. Consequences would come later. Investigations would follow. But the most dangerous part, the lie spoken aloud, had been dismantled piece by piece. And for the first time since my name had been whispered with suspicion, it was spoken again with clarity. Exposure doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with silence, heavy, unavoidable, and final. In the days that followed graduation, the campus felt unfamiliar, like a place I had outgrown overnight. Word spread quickly but not wildly. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was procedure. Official notices replaced whispers. Meetings were scheduled. Titles mattered again. The apology came first. It wasn't public in the way the accusation had been. There was no microphone, no audience, no dramatic pause. It arrived as a formal letter sent through institutional channels addressed to me by name, copied to administrators, legal counsel, and a review committee. The language was careful, legal, restrained. It acknowledged that a false statement had been made, that the accusation lacked factual basis, that harm had occurred. It did not mention the word homewrecker. It didn't need to. What mattered was that the record now reflected the truth, not my version of it, the documented one. The consequences unfolded methodically after that. Her advisory roles were suspended pending investigation. Invitations she had once taken for granted were quietly rescinded. Committees removed her name from their letterhead. Donor events proceeded without her presence. Influence, I learned, evaporates faster than it accumulates. Her husband requested a leave of absence. At first, it was framed as temporary time to focus on family. Then the language shifted. A formal review was announced. Classes were reassigned. Graduate students were offered alternative supervision. No one celebrated. This wasn't a victory. It was an unmasking. I was asked to provide a statement for the record. I did. It was brief, factual. I declined to speculate on motives. I didn't describe emotions. I let the documents speak. The person who had intervened at the ceremony reached out once more, not to advise, but to confirm that I would not face retaliation. Protections were put in place. Recommendations were restored. The conditional job offer was reaffirmed this time without hesitation. You handled yourself with restraint, I was told. That matters. What no one could quantify was the cost of that restraint. I woke up some mornings expecting the weight to still be there, the tightness in my chest, the constant vigilance. But slowly, imperceptibly, it loosened. The world didn't feel safe overnight, but it felt clearer. People began to approach me again. Carefully at first, apologetically. Some admitted they had believed the rumor. Others said they hadn't known what to think. I listened without responding much. Understanding doesn't always require forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't require explanation. The student whose testimony had been protected reached out through an intermediary. She didn't thank me. She didn't apologize. She simply said she was safe now. That was enough. What struck me most was how ordinary everything became afterward. I returned library books. I packed up my apartment. I forwarded my mail. Life resumed its quiet rhythms, but with a difference. I no longer felt like I was holding something together with silence. The truth had been set down, and I didn't have to carry it anymore. One afternoon, as I walked across campus for the last time, I passed a bulletin board where my name had once been removed from a list of contributors. It had been restored. No announcement. No explanation. Just there again, as if it had never been taken down. That small correction meant more to me than the apology. I thought about how easily my story could have ended differently, how close I had come to being defined by a word chosen for convenience, how quickly systems protect themselves by sacrificing those with the least power. And I thought about the moment on stage, how still I had remained while the accusation hung in the air, how restraint had been mistaken for guilt, how preparation had been mistaken for weakness. I didn't feel proud of surviving it. I felt clear about who I was, clear about what silence can be when it's chosen deliberately, clear about the difference between being quiet and being erased. On my last day in town, I ran into the dean at a cafe near campus. He recognized me immediately and approached with visible hesitation. I wanted to say he began, then stopped. He tried again. You showed remarkable composure. I nodded politely. We failed you, he added quietly. That acknowledgement mattered more than an apology ever could. I left town the next morning, driving west toward a job that offered stability and distance. The road stretched ahead, familiar and unknown at once. I didn't turn on the radio. I let the quiet sit with me. There would be no headline about what really happened. No viral clip correcting the lie. Justice, I was learning, is often quieter than injustice. But it lasts longer. As I crossed the city limits, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not triumph, but alignment. The sense that for the first time in a long while, my life belonged entirely to me again. The culprit had been exposed. Not through spectacle, but through process. Not through outrage, but through evidence. And I had walked away without needing to raise my voice. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in layers, measured and procedural, the way institutions protect themselves while pretending neutrality. What mattered was that they came at all. Within a week of graduation, formal notices began circulating. Not rumors this time, statements stamped with authority. Committees were convened. Independent reviews announced. The language was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. What had been whispered was now being examined under oath and policy. I was contacted by legal counsel representing the institution. The email was polite, almost deferential. They asked if I would be willing to provide clarification should it be needed. I agreed on one condition: everything in writing. No informal conversations, no hallway assurances. They accepted immediately. That shift alone told me how thoroughly the power balance had changed. Her resignation from advisory roles was framed as temporary at first, pending review. Then the phrasing hardened. Effective immediately. Then came the removal of her name from publications, websites, and donor acknowledgements. It was done quietly, efficiently, as though erasing a chalkboard no one wanted to look at too closely. Her husband's situation followed a similar pattern. A leave of absence became a formal investigation. Grants were frozen, graduate students reassigned. The university emphasized student protection and ethical oversight. The words sounded rehearsed, but the actions were real. I wasn't asked to celebrate. I wasn't asked to comment publicly. In fact, I was advised not to. The institution wanted containment, not spectacle. I understood that instinct well enough not to fight it. What I did ask for was something smaller. I requested a written statement confirming that the accusation made against me during the ceremony was false and unsupported. Not for revenge. For my record. For my future. For the background checks and references that would follow me long after the campus moved on. It was granted without resistance. The statement was clear, unambiguous. It acknowledged harm. It cleared my name. It required signatures from multiple offices. That mattered. I forwarded it to my future employer with a brief note. For transparency. They responded within hours, reaffirming the offer and apologizing for what I had endured. No follow-up questions, no hesitation. That was the moment I finally believed it was over. Not because justice had been dramatic or satisfying, but because it had been recognized as necessary. People reacted differently once the truth settled. Some reached out to apologize. Others avoided me entirely, perhaps ashamed of how quickly they had believed the worst. A few tried to frame my silence as strategic brilliance, as though I had planned everything. I didn't correct them. They needed a story that made sense of their discomfort. The truth was simpler. I had waited because I had no other choice. One afternoon, I received a message from an administrator I had barely interacted with before. She asked if I would be willing to speak to a small group of staff about student vulnerability and power dynamics. I declined politely. I wasn't interested in becoming a lesson. What I wanted was closure. That came unexpectedly. I was packing boxes in my apartment when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Almost. It was her. Her voice sounded different, thinner, stripped of the confidence I remembered. She didn't apologize immediately. She circled the call with explanations, fear, blame that drifted outward without landing anywhere. She spoke about pressure, about protecting her family, about mistakes. I listened, not because she deserved an audience, because I needed to hear how far she would go to avoid naming what she had done. When she finally stopped talking, I spoke once. "You accused me publicly," I said. "You knew it wasn't true." Silence. "I won't accept your explanation," I continued. "But I accept that you won't do it again. That's all I need." She started to cry then. I ended the call. That was the last time I spoke to her. As the investigations continued, I moved forward. I relocated for work. I learned new routines, new streets, new colleagues who knew nothing about what had happened and didn't need to. I liked that anonymity. It felt earned. Every so often an update arrived by email. Another role vacated. Another policy revised. Another confirmation that the record stood as it should. I filed each message away and returned to my life. I noticed something unexpected during that time. I wasn't angry. I had imagined that once the truth was acknowledged, rage would follow, that I would want apologies shouted, consequences paraded. Instead, I felt something quieter and more stable. Distance. Distance from the fear that had shaped my decisions. Distance from the version of myself who believed silence was only survival. Distance from the lie that power always wins. Justice hadn't restored what I lost. It had simply stopped the damage from continuing. And that was enough. Months later, I received my diploma in the mail. The heavy paper felt almost symbolic in my hands. I placed it in a frame and hung it in my new apartment not as a trophy but as a marker. Proof that I had crossed something intact. I thought about the ceremony often, not with bitterness but with clarity. About how easily a lie can command attention. About how rarely truth announces itself. About how restraint is invisible until it's tested. I didn't tell my story publicly. I didn't write op-eds or speak at panels. I let the process stand on its own, because justice doesn't always need a narrator. Sometimes it just needs witnesses. Life after something like that doesn't snap back into place. It settles slowly like dust after a long collapse. You don't notice the quiet right away. At first, you're still listening for impact. I started my new job 3 weeks after graduation. A different city, a different office. Glass walls, neutral colors, the hum of printers, and low conversations that had nothing to do with me. No one there knew my name beyond what was printed on my badge. No one watched me the way people had on campus. No one weighed my presence against a rumor. That anonymity felt unreal at first. I kept expecting something to follow me into the room, an assumption, a question, a sideways glance. It didn't. I learned my responsibilities quickly. I stayed late when necessary. I asked questions without fear of being misinterpreted. When my manager complimented my work, it was direct and uncomplicated. "You're thorough," she said once. "We need more of that." I went home that evening and sat on the floor of my apartment, letting that sentence echo. It was the first compliment I had accepted without bracing myself. Still, there were moments when the past resurfaced unexpectedly. A meeting where someone raised their voice. A hallway where laughter stopped too suddenly. An email sent late at night with vague urgency. Each time my body reacted before my mind could intervene, I reminded myself where I was, who I was now, that I wasn't under observation anymore. I spoke to my mother every Sunday. At first, she avoided mentioning graduation altogether, as if the memory might reopen something fragile. Eventually, she asked questions, not accusatory, not fearful, just trying to understand how something like that could happen so publicly. "It happens because people don't expect resistance," I told her. "And because they underestimate patience." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "Not for winning, for not letting it change you." I thought about that long after the call ended. Had it changed me? Yes. But not in the way people expected. I was less apologetic, less eager to explain myself. I stopped overqualifying my statements, stopped softening my certainty to make others comfortable. I learned that calm didn't require invisibility, and strength didn't require noise. Every few weeks, an update arrived from the institution. Investigations concluded, findings documented, policies revised, names removed, names added. The tone of the emails grew increasingly distant, as if the system itself wanted to forget the disruption and return to equilibrium. I didn't mind. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had shifted the balance. It had placed accountability where it belonged. What followed was administrative housekeeping. One message, however, stood out. It informed me that the final review had concluded, that the false accusation made against me had been formally entered into record as defamation, that corrective actions had been taken, that no further participation was required from me. I closed the email and didn't archive it immediately. I sat with it, noticing how little I felt. No surge of relief, no satisfaction. Just completion. I realized then that the most difficult part hadn't been the accusation itself. It had been the waiting, the months of restraint, of choosing silence while being misunderstood, of trusting a process that had not yet proven itself trustworthy. Endurance is exhausting in a way few people acknowledge. It drains you quietly without visible scars. You learn to conserve energy, to survive on fragments of certainty. Once the waiting ended, I had to relearn how to live without that vigilance. I began to do small things I had postponed for years. I joined a weekend running group. I took a class that had nothing to do with my career. I let myself be seen without calculating the consequences. When people asked about my college years, I gave a simplified version. Hard work, scholarships, graduation. I didn't lie. I just didn't offer the parts that required context. My story didn't need to be public to be valid. One evening, after a long workday, I walked past a graduation ceremony happening at a nearby campus. Families gathered outside, taking photos, laughing, hugging. Caps flew into the air. Applause echoed across the lawn. I stopped and watched from a distance. For the first time, I didn't feel tension in my chest. No bitterness, no sense of loss, just recognition. I had crossed that threshold already under circumstances I wouldn't have chosen, but with integrity intact. The person I had been before all of this believed that silence was protection. The person I was becoming understood something deeper. Silence can be a strategy, a boundary, a refusal to be pulled into someone else's chaos. It can be an act of control rather than submission if it's chosen, not imposed. I thought about the woman who had accused me, about how much effort she had invested in controlling perception, about how quickly that control dissolved once the truth entered the room with witnesses. Power built on fear is fragile. Power built on credibility lasts longer. I didn't know what her future looked like. I didn't need to. My own had regained its shape. On my desk next to my computer, I kept a single printed page from the investigation, the statement clearing my name. Not as a reminder of harm, but as evidence of something else. That truth doesn't always rush. Sometimes it waits for you to be ready. I had been ready, not because I was fearless, because I was patient, and that patience had carried me through the worst moment of my life without breaking me. As I turned off the lights that night, I understood something that would have sounded impossible months earlier. I wasn't defined by what happened to me. I was defined by how I stood when it did. The first real morning I felt free didn't arrive with clarity or celebration. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. I woke up before my alarm's sunlight filtering through the blinds of my new apartment. For a moment, my body braced automatically, waiting for the familiar weight, the instinct to scan for danger, to rehearse explanations. Then nothing followed. No tightening in my chest. No urgency. Just stillness. That was how I knew it was over. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. Cars moved steadily below. People walked with purpose, carrying their own invisible histories. No one knew mine. And for the first time, that felt like a gift instead of a loss. Work settled into a rhythm that felt honest. I was evaluated on output, not perception. On accuracy, not rumor. When I spoke in meetings, my words were met with consideration rather than suspicion. I wasn't watched. I wasn't measured for subtext. I was simply allowed to exist. That permission changed me more than justice ever could. Months passed. The investigation concluded fully. Final determinations were issued. The institution closed the matter with formal language and legal finality. There were no announcements, no public reckoning. The world moved on as it always does, and so did I. Occasionally, I would think back to the ceremony not with pain but with perspective. I could see now how calculated the accusation had been, how it relied on spectacle, how it assumed I would react emotionally, defensively, predictably. That assumption had been its flaw. I hadn't needed to expose anyone. I hadn't needed to perform outrage. I had only needed to remain steady long enough for the truth to stand on its own. People misunderstand quiet endurance. They mistake it for submission. But endurance is an act of choice. It's the decision to stay aligned with yourself when external forces try to define you. One evening, I received an email from a junior colleague asking for advice. She was navigating a workplace dynamic that felt unfair, unbalanced. She didn't know my history. She just sensed that I might understand. I didn't tell her my story. I told her this instead. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that reacting isn't the same as responding. She thanked me. That felt like closure. I visited my mother a few months later. We sat at the kitchen table where so many of our hardest conversations had taken place over the years. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You're lighter," she said. "Not happier, just steadier. I nodded. That was exactly it. I hadn't emerged victorious in the way stories often promise. There was no dramatic reversal, no moment where everyone who doubted me apologized. What I had gained was something quieter and far more durable: self-trust. I trusted my judgment now, trusted my ability to wait without disappearing, trusted that truth when handled carefully doesn't need force to be effective. The label that had once threatened to define me had dissolved completely, not because it was disproven loudly, but because it couldn't survive scrutiny. Lies rely on momentum. Truth relies on structure. I learned that power isn't always held by those who speak first or loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the person who knows when not to speak and prepares instead. On the anniversary of my graduation, I took the day off work. I didn't attend a ceremony or mark the date publicly. I went for a long walk, letting the city unfold around me. I passed a courthouse, its steps worn smooth by time and accountability. I smiled at the symbolism and kept walking. That chapter of my life was closed, not erased, not forgotten, just complete. I no longer needed to stand tall in opposition. I was already standing unburdened, unnamed by lies, grounded in my own certainty. In the end, justice hadn't arrived with applause. It arrived with alignment. And that was enough. Some injustices announce themselves loudly. Others unfold in silence, depending on whether the person targeted will break under pressure or remain intact long enough for the truth to surface. What I learned is this: dignity doesn't require defense in the moment it's attacked. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires documentation. And sometimes it requires trusting that the truth, when presented with clarity and timing, can speak more convincingly than emotion ever could. I don't believe suffering automatically makes someone stronger. But I do believe that choosing integrity, especially when it costs you comfort, changes the way you move through the world afterward. You stop chasing validation. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. You begin to recognize your own steadiness as proof. If you've ever been misjudged, mislabeled, or spoken over, I hope this reminds you of something important. Being quiet doesn't mean you're powerless. It can mean you're preparing. It can mean you're protecting something more valuable than pride, your future. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? And if you'd like more stories about resilience, truth, and quiet justice, consider subscribing. Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that don't rush to speak.